director, our teachers, our guest of the day, Professor Dr. Preeti Mishra ma'am, and all my fellow mates. Warm greeting to one and all present here. On behalf of Institute of Legal Studies, I, Shifali Sharma, extend a very sincere warm welcome to one and all present here on this online guest lecture, and also want to extend a note of thanks to our guest of honor, Professor Dr. Preeti Mishra ma'am. Criminal justice is one of the critical areas of human rights where the legal system is tested on a continuous basis for preservation of peace and security in society on the one hand, and preservation of human rights for both victims of crime and person accused on it on the other hand. I hope by the end of this lecture, there will be more clarity about administration of criminal justice and human rights. Queries related to the topic are welcomed in the chat box section. Now, I would request our respected PC Mishra sir to welcome our esteemed guest.
Good morning, students, and most warm welcome to our esteemed guest, Professor P.T. Mishra, ma'am. I, Dr. Prakash Chand Mishra, on behalf of Institute of Legal Studies, welcome all of you for this guest lecture. It's my proud privilege to introduce to our guest a warm welcome and heartiest welcome to ma'am, Professor P.T. Mishra, ma'am. Presently, ma'am is a head of the Department of the Human Rights at Central University, Baba Sahab Bhimrao Ambedkar University, Lucknow. Ma'am's keen area of interest is especially emphasized on the constitutional law, family law, and criminal law. Ma'am has more than 100 publications that published in the various national and international reviews. 8 PhD scholars awarded under her able guidance. Ma'am has authored many books, but one of the books that is popularly Domestic Violence Against Women, Legal Control and Judicial Response, Deep and Deep publication, New Delhi, gives encyclopedic knowledge to our whole legal fraternity. Ma'am has attended several sessions, international sessions too, that one of the IUAES 16th World Congress on Human Development and Cultural Diversity, which was held in the China. Preeti Mishra ma'am has encyclopedic knowledge relating to the constitutional law, family law, and criminal law. She has a great personality in the field of law, and it's all and everyone knows her contribution to the society itself. And now, on this day, I welcome to the ma'am that we have organized a lecture for our betterment for our students. And the topic of lecture is Administration of Criminal Justice and Human Rights. Most welcome to the ma'am. Please grace with your precious words that keep our students in an enlightened manner to pave their knowledge in coming years. So I most welcome to you, ma'am, from the bottom of my heart, from the ILS family.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes, ma'am. You are visible as well as audible too.
Okay. Thank you, Mishra ji. Thank you so much for such a nice introduction. Today's topic of presentation is criminal justice administration and human rights. So let us first understand what is the objective of this presentation. The objective of this presentation is to provide students an insight into the intricacies of human rights issues which are involved in the overall administration of justice system in India. Then through this lecture, I would also like to introduce to the students various aspects of criminology, penology, and victimology also. And then I would like to acquaint the students with the different functionaries which are involved in the administration of criminal justice. And then another objective of this presentation is to highlight the current issues and debates regarding criminal justice administration and human rights, and especially in this lecture, I will be analyzing the role of Supreme Court so far as securing of human rights are concerned regarding the administration of criminal justice. So let me first introduce the topic, that how this criminal justice system evolved, who are the functionaries who are responsible for this criminal justice administration, and then what are the basic principles of criminal justice jurisprudence. And then I will be discussing various human rights issues and the role of judiciary. So as you all know that human rights are what every individual shall have by the virtue of his birth as a human being. There are inherent and inalienable human rights, because if a person wants to surrender his or her own human rights, he is not allowed to. That's why you know that suicide has been an offense under the Indian Penal Code. However, in the course of development of society, the individual had to sacrifice some of his rights in order to keep the human society intact and capable of protecting all the individuals. Later on, some new tasks came to be added for the purpose of the protection of the society, and then various people were interested upon with various duties, and some are having the right, which somewhere gave tussle to the conflict and controversies between the different individuals. So the discharging of these duties and the exercise of these rights led to the violation of human rights of some of the individuals. So faced with the problem of protecting his person and those of his family members and that of the group in which the person lived, because you all know that in the evolution theory we read that man used to live in small groups. So there used to be tussle between the different groups which were there, because groups were formed on the basis of the different interests of the different groups. So when the interest of one individual clashed with the interest of another individual, that led to the fights between the different groups, and because of which the persons who belong to a group, they were faced with the problem of protecting not only his own person but that of his family members and that of the sometimes that of the group also, and for the purpose of protection of the possessions. So the early man was often forced to use the violence, and this gave rise to a situation where might became the right, because the weaker elements in the society or in the group could not protect themselves as against the tyranny or the torture of the stronger ones. And that's why the group started congregating under the strong leaders, and ultimately the state emerged out of a social contract. The task of protecting the weak and restraining the strong passed on the state. And as a part of this contract, the individuals agreed to keep away themselves from the violence as a means to settle the problem and abide by the parameters set by the state and the society. The role and function of the state were enumerated in the basic law of any legal system that we know by the name of the Constitution. And all the activities of the state were to be in conformity with the constitution of that particular legal system. So we see that how this collective desire of the society to protect oneself, to protect the family members, to protect the group, or the for the purpose of the protection of the property, they gave the governance power in the hands of some selected persons of the society that is known as the government. So in order to ensure peaceable condition in the society and to enable its members to enjoy all the freedom and fruits of their efforts without any kind of hindrance, society began to regulate its members through the code or the laws. So the codification started, and the passing of the laws started in order to regulate the behavior of the individuals of the society. So when and where the need was felt, specific parameters of behavior were prescribed for any activity. And for that purpose, for the purpose of regulating that particular activity, the laws were enacted. So the laws became the collective desire of the society, which is expressed through the representatives in the legislatures. So being the need-based, majority of the law in a society are reactive in nature, as they are very specific responses to a specific situation. Because we all know that when we talk about the definition of crime, there is no settled definition of crime, because the different authors have defined in a different way. Because as the moral standard of a society changes, the definition of the crime also changes. Sometimes a particular act or the omission of a person is a crime in a society, but at some other point of time, it is not a crime. Like the adultery was offense under the Indian Penal Code. But after the Supreme Court case, recently the case was decided by the Supreme Court, and now it is no longer punishable. So it depends upon the moral standards of the society, and you all know the standard of the morality or the public opinion keep on changing. So the definition of crime also changing. But the very settled definition of the law, and various academicians agree with the definition of the Stephen, where it defines the crime as an act or the omission which is forbidden by the law, as well as revolting to the moral sentiment of the society. So it is a widely accepted definition given by the Stephen regarding the offense, because we all know that an act becomes criminal only when a particular act defines it as a crime, and not before that. And then it is also very, very abhorring to the moral sentiments of the society whenever a crime is committed, because not only the peace of the person is disturbed against whom the crime is committed, but whole of his family members, and even the neighborhood society is also disturbed if any crime is committed in your vicinity. So it is a widely accepted definition of Stephen, where he says that it is an act and omission forbidden by law, as well as revolting to the moral sentiments of the society. Then some other authors have defined it in terms of the violation of the public law, like the Kenny and the Austin and the Blackstone say that that this act of crime is nothing but the violation of a public law, and it is not a sphere of private law. Because you all know, and you must have studied in your LLB classes also, that what is the difference between the private wrong and the public wrong. So when we compare the public wrong and the private wrong, then it becomes much more clear that what is the meaning of crime. So Kenny, Austin, and Blackstone all define it in terms of public law. So crime is distinct from the contract and tort in terms of its nature, in terms of the consequences, and also in terms of the redressal which is given whenever the crime or other kinds of private wrongs are committed. So if you look at the nature of the crime as distinct from the tort and the contract, then tort and contract are of private nature, because contract is indulged into between two parties. It is an agreement between two or more persons, and the tort is also committed when person infringes the legal right of other. So there is a kind of personal contract in case of contract and the tort. But so far as crime is concerned, it is public in nature, because whenever the crime is committed, it is not only the crime against the person against whom it has been committed, but also against the whole of the society. And that's why the state is one of the party when the case is filed against the offender or the person who has committed the crime. And if you look at the consequences, you will also find that in contract or in tort, only the persons affected are involved. But in crime, as I already told you, that it affects a majority of people. Then if you look at the redressal, you will find that in crime, there are punishment provided in the Indian Penal Code and in other specific laws also, whenever any act or omission is committed. And but in cases of contract or tort, the damages are given or the compensation are given. Though with the growth of the victimology, in criminal law also, now the compensation has come into vogue. And you must have noticed that in many of the cases, the compensation are also being given whenever the crime is committed. So if you look at the criminal justice system, so now I think it is clear that what is the meaning of crime and how it is distinct from the tort and the contract. And now if we look at the basic objectives of the criminal justice, then the basic objectives of the criminal justice can be defined in terms of the penological point of view. Because the criminal justice system objective is retributive also, it is preventive, it is deterrent, it is reformative also. And sometimes the objective of the criminal justice system is also to force the people to expiate his guilt, to repent upon the conduct that he has committed, either by way of going under imprisonment or through some other measures that can be there in the IPC itself or in the specific law. So what is the objective of the criminal justice system? The objective of criminal justice system is to prevent the growth of the deviant behavior in the society, to detect the deviant behavior and evaluate the extent of the deviance which has been committed by the offender, and then also to adjudicate the damages and consequences of the aberrations to the society. And this criminal justice administration also prescribes the quantum of punishment which is needed to correct the behavior of the deviant persons through some corrective measures. Thus, the basic philosophy of criminal justice system is to reform the person who has committed the crime so that he can be brought back to the society and can lead a normal life. So these are the objectives of criminal justice system. Now, if we talk about the components of criminal justice system, means who are responsible for the administration of criminal justice, or what are the functionaries which are involved in the administration of criminal justice, then we find that there are 4 wings dealing with different aspects of crime control in the society. And number 1, there are lawgivers, that is the legislators or the lawmakers, because only the lawmakers have the responsibility to give the parameters of behavior in the society and to define a crime according to the perception and need of the society. And the lawmakers also prescribe the procedures for the verification of the deviance. It means how the trial will be done, how the investigations will be done. All these prescribed procedures are there for the determination of the guilt, and that is done by the legislature only. And the legislatures also decide about the nature and the quantum of punishment. So all the laws, whether it is criminal law or any other law, it all must be in consonance with the basic law of the Constitution. So whether it is our IPC or whether it is any specific law defining the crime, all must satisfy the basic elements or the basic principles which are there in the Constitution itself. Then, besides having the legislature who are responsible for making the law, there are law enforcers. And all the societies are required to enforce the law. And for this purpose, they have a police organization. And the primary law enforcement machinery, we all know, is the police. And they are charged with the maintenance of peace in the society, to prevent and detect the occurrence of a crime, to collect and present the material evidence, to prove that violation of law has taken place before the judicial authorities. And these police personnel also assist in the administration of justice. So it may be noted that law enforcers have no authority to pronounce the guilt or punish a wrongdoer, but they are only for the purpose of the trial and investigation and for framing the charge that a particular person has committed a particular sort of crime under a particular law. Then very important wing of administration of criminal justice is judiciary, which is solely responsible for the adjudication of the guilt. So this wing aims to ascertain and determine whether a breach of law has in fact taken place, and also evaluate the fact and circumstances on the basis of evidences given and witnesses produced the court determines the guilt of the person who has committed the crime. And the court also looks into the fact that what is the extent of the violation of law and what punishment can be given for it, so that it will serve the purpose of reforming the person who has committed the crime. Because the basic objective of criminal justice jurisprudence in modern times is not to punish or not to take the revenge from the person who has committed the crime. The more emphasis is on the reformative approach of the criminal justice jurisprudence. So the judiciary also looks into the facts and the circumstances which has been there in the commission of the crime, and accordingly it decides its sentencing policy. And that's why we don't have any kind of settled principles of law for the purpose of pronouncing the sentences whenever the crime is committed. So the judiciary serves as the protector of the constitutional principles and ensures that all the organs of the state follow the constitutional ideals which are involved in the administration of criminal justice. And fourthly and lastly, the important functionary of criminal justice administration is correctional administration, which carries out the punishment awarded by the judiciary. And the aim of this correctional institution is to reform the citizens and to recycle them back into the society. So there, for that purpose, there are prisons, there are reformatories, there are observation homes and restitution centers also. Because we all know that all that because of the time when the crime is committed, it not only committed by the adult person, but also by the juveniles or by the children. So the children cannot be subjected to same procedure which is there for the trial of the adult. So different kinds of correctional institutions are there so far as the criminals are concerned, depending upon their age and the mental capacity. So these have been the functionaries which are involved in the administration of criminal justice. Now we will look into the fact that what are the various safeguards in the criminal justice administration to prevent the arbitrariness as well as for the protection of the human rights. So one of the very important thing is that whatever is being done, it should be done through the due process. So prevent the arbitrariness and to provide the equitable justice to each and everyone. The criminal justice system in India has adopted the concept of due process. So under this, everyone is presumed to be innocent unless the guilt is proved beyond reasonable doubt. So one of the fundamental principles of criminal jurisprudence is that everyone is presumed to be innocent. And you all must have heard this proverb that may 99 may go scot-free, but one innocent should not be punished. भले ही 99 अपराधी या 100 अपराधी छूट जाएं, लेकिन किसी एक निरपराध को सजा नहीं होनी चाहिए. So the presumption of innocence is very basic principles of constitutional jurisprudence so far as the criminal justice administration is concerned. And that's why the guilt which is to be proved, it is to be proved beyond reasonable doubt, है ना. तो सुई के नोक के बराबर भी शक नहीं होना चाहिए कि उस व्यक्ति ने क्राइम किया है या नहीं किया है. So all the parameters of the crime which are there for a particular offense must be fulfilled. So a citizen should be strictly judged in accordance with the procedure duly established by law. Because the Article 14 of the Constitution ensures that all are equal before the laws and everybody has got the equal protection of the laws. So as far as the criminals are concerned, they are not to be discriminated. Because Article 14 says that a state will not discriminate between its citizens. And everyone will be subjected to same kind of procedure whenever the crime is committed. So it does not matter howsoever standard or social status a person enjoys in the society, he will also be subjected to the same procedure, and the same machinery will be there for adjudicating his guilt as for a common person. So every citizen should be given a fair and reasonable opportunity to challenge the accusations against him and to establish his innocence. And in case if there is any kind of doubt, then the benefit of doubt can be given to him. So if we talk about the different safeguards which are there in the criminal justice system, we find that since human rights are concerned with the dignity of the individual, so criminal justice system provides certain safeguards to ensure that citizens are protected and their human rights are not violated. So it says that all the laws are tested on the touchstone of the Constitution, and then the enforcement should be within the four corners of the law, and the adjudication of the guilt should only be done by the judiciary, and all the wings of the criminal justice system need to follow the due process clause as well as the principles of natural justice. So what does it mean? That whenever a crime is committed, the interpretation of that particular act will be done in a very, very strict sense. It means if the criminal law is there must be a strict interpretation. And what is the meaning of strict interpretation? You must have studied the literal interpretation of law or the grammatical interpretation of law. It means, for example, a person has committed the offense of theft. Then whatever essential elements are there in under the section 378 of the IPC, all those essential ingredients must be met with. So unnecessarily, by stretching the definition on our own, we cannot make any person indicted of any offense of theft. Only when that person satisfies all the elements which are given for the offense of theft, only then his guilt will be determined as the guilt of theft or the offense of theft. So very, very strict interpretation of criminal law is to be done. And then you all know what are the natural principles of justice. What are the natural justice principles? It means the rule against bias and odi alteram partem. It means no person can be a judge in his or her own case, and then the right of hearing should be given. So if a person has committed a crime, then full opportunity should be given to him for explaining his things, so that he may come either with clean hands, or if he is not clean, or if he is not innocent, he may be punished in accordance with the law. But it must be ensured that he is given a right of hearing. Then whatever judgment is being passed, it must be a reasoned order. Means the court must justify that whatever punishment they are giving, it must be supported with reasons, with justifications, that why one kind of punishment is being given and why other kind of punishment is not being given. So whether the principles of natural justice has been followed or not, it is very, very touchstone of the administration of criminal justice so far as the protection of human rights are concerned. So in order to maintain the order and peace in the society, and to prevent and detect the control the crime, the state provides its law enforcement machinery, that is the police, with very, very wide-ranging powers. But you all know that the whatever powers are given to the police, if these powers are used arbitrarily, then it will impinge upon the dignity and liberty of the individual. So in order to preserve the human rights of the citizens, it becomes very, very necessary to safeguard the basic human rights in the administration of criminal justice. So the concern for human right of individual in the criminal justice administration is of recent origin, because we all know that if we compare the criminology of present times with the criminology of earlier times, we find that in earlier times the very, very harsh punishment used to be there even for the simple offenses. And not only the animate things were punished, but inanimate things were also punished. And if you have studied the history of criminal law, you must have found that even the trees and even the animals were punished in older times. But in present times, with the advent of the studies of psychology and various scientific studies done in the criminology, now we all know that the criminal is not a born criminal. He becomes criminal because of the surroundings in which he or she lives, or then there can be different other reasons also responsible because of which a person commits a crime. Because sometimes the crime may be situational also, because one is not want to indulge into offense, but there are circumstances, there are forces, or if he or she is there in such a peer group which is criminal in nature, then he is forced to commit the crime. So sometimes inadvertently the offenses are committed. So if we compare the criminology of present time and that of the older time, we find there is a vast difference. So because of all the medical jurisprudence that has grown and because of the psychology, because we all know that there are certain internal factors as well as external factors because of which a person commits a crime. So external factors mean there are circumstances, there are situations surrounding the person concerned, but then the internal factors, if we talk about, there are certain physiology of a person, because we all know that there are certain kinds of glands in our society and different kinds of secretions are there in our body which decides our mental status. That's why some persons are very, very aggressive and some are very, very passive in nature. So there are the endocrine glands in our body which are also responsible for the sort of behavior that we indulge in. So with the studies of this medical jurisprudence and psychology and all these things, now it is clear that a person is not a born criminal. And that's why the object of criminology or the penology has also changed. In earlier times, the retribution used to be the very objective of the penology, that tooth for tooth and eye for an eye. But with the understanding of the psychology and with the understanding of the criminology that a person is not criminal, now we don't believe in the retributive theory of punishment. Now it is more in the nature of reformation, because here we treat the criminal as a patient, that he is mentally ill or he is not able to understand the nature of his act. That's why he is committing the crime. So the object of penology has also changed. So if you look at the ancient India, we find that in Vedas and scriptures provided the basis for the Hindu jurisprudence and the criminal justice administration. And in the villages, people used to assemble, and the king, with the assistance of his villagers and townfolk, used to administer the justice. And the people used to directly participate in the adjudication of the guilt and awarding the punishment. Because you all know, in older times, the punishments were given in public. And the public hanging was very much in vogue in those times. But in present scenario, we just cannot think of public hanging. Though some person demand in certain times certain types of crimes, and like in Hyderabad case where the people take the law in their own hands and they kill the criminal. But that is but that act was very much criticized because it is very, very barbaric in nature, and this kind of thing doesn't fit in modern human right jurisprudence. So the object has changed. So earlier the people themselves used to take part in the adjudication of the guilt and awarding the punishment. But now today we have the authority responsible who are there for the trial and investigation and also for the purpose of the adjudication of the guilt. So in older times, the emphasis was on the good of the society and the impact of punishment on the individual of very less relevance. And the punishment, as I told you, is of the purpose of restitution. But with the coming up of the colonial era with the Britishers, because you all know that Britishers never like to interfere with the personal laws of the Hindus or the Muslims. So they introduced some kind of egalitarian principle in the criminal jurisprudence also, and today which has assumed the character of the reformist one. So though the Britishers adopted the dual standard, they had the different kinds of laws for themselves and for the Indians, and the whites were given much more privilege. But even then, we can give to their credit that they gave us this IPC, which is based upon the egalitarian principles of law, because it does not discriminate on the basis of the class or the caste. So a kind of equality principles are very much involved in the framing of the Indian Penal Code. So if we look at the human rights jurisprudence, how it evolved in the administration of criminal justice, we find that this human behavior was at its very worst at the time of the Second World War. And after that, the United Nations took upon itself the role of crusader for the human rights. And as the preamble of the United Nations Charter says that it has been incorporated in order to reaffirm the faith in fundamental human rights and in the dignity and worth of the human person. And there must be equal right of men and women, and whether the nations are large or small, the standard of human rights will be the same. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948 and which was followed by the Covenants on Political and Civil Rights and Socio-Economic and Cultural Rights in 1966, the India also adopted its constitution in 1950 and included a special part of fundamental rights. So if we look upon the constitutional basis of criminal justice jurisprudence, we find that there are constitutional foundations to the criminal justice jurisprudence, because as per the Article 372 of the Constitution, whether there are pre-constitutional substantive laws or whether it is the procedural laws which are pre-constitutional, and these all are validated because of the Article 372 of the Constitution. But this power of Article 372, which gives validity to the pre-constitutional substantive and procedural laws, is balanced by some restrictions which have been imposed by Article 13, Clause 1 and 2 of the Constitution. So, in fundamental rights are given in Part 3 of the Constitution, but these rights are not absolute. Article 13, Clause 1 says that all the existing laws that are inconsistent with the fundamental rights are to be held void to the extent of the inconsistency. And then Article 13, Clause 2 says that any future law that help the effect of abrogating or abridging the fundamental rights shall be void. It means whatever law is going to be enacted, whether it is substantive law or it is a procedural law in the administration of criminal justice, it must satisfy the constitutional foundations of fundamental rights. It cannot abrogate the fundamental rights. So even if a person is a criminal, he has committed a crime, but he will not be deprived of his fundamental rights, subject to certain restrictions that may be there. So if we look upon the different constitutional guarantees which are there, so far as the administration of criminal justice is concerned, we find that some articles are very, very important from this particular point of view. That is the constitutional basis of administration of criminal justice. So very important article is that of Article 14, which talks about right to equality. Then you all know we have this Article 21, which says that no person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except according to procedure established by law. And you all know that there has been lots of water have flown from A.K. Gopalan to Maneka Gandhi, because earlier the Article 21 was interpreted very, very strictly, and whenever a person's life was to be taken away or personal liberty was to be restricted when the offense was committed by him, then only touchstone was that it must satisfy the procedure of law. It means we had to strictly apply the procedure of law. But after Maneka Gandhi's case, you all know that the due process clause of American Constitution has been read into Article 21. Now, whatever procedure is should be there, it should be just, fair and reasonable. So even if a person has committed a crime, and if a particular law is there for restricting his life or liberty, even then that law has to be tested whether it is just, fair or reasonable or not. And this Article 14, which guarantees the right to equality. So though the equality should be there, but equality cannot be absolute. You all know that there can be reasonable classifications. So for different categories of crime, we can have different kinds of punishments. So crimes have also been, the nature of crime has also been categorized, and the punishments are also categorized. So it does not mean that we are negating the right to equality, because there is reasonable classification. And what is the test for the reasonable classification? That classification must be based upon the intelligible difference. Yeah, it means whatever law is being made and what is the objective. It should be justified for that purpose for which that particular law has been made. So even if in criminal law you find different kinds of punishments for the same offense, so it is a reasonable classification. So it nowhere negates the right to equality that is guaranteed by Article 14 of the Constitution. Then you all know that Article 20 and Article 22 are also very, very important, where administration of criminal justice is involved. So Article 20 is very important, which talks about the rights against the diverse modes of acquisitions, and then it says that ex post facto law, double jeopardy, and self-incrimination. We will be talking in detail. And then in Article 22, there are certain procedural safeguards that when a person is being arrested, how the arrest should be made, what the precautions should be taken, and how long the remand to the police can be given. So all these, and that of the legal aid also it talks about. So Article 22 is very, very important so far as procedural law is concerned, and there also the human rights principles are involved. Then other articles which are very, very important are the writ jurisdictions of the Constitution. That is Article 32 and 2 to 6 of the Constitution, where various kinds of writs can be followed. You all know that when a person is illegally detained, the writ of habeas corpus can be issued, and then different other writs are also there which play a part in the administration of criminal justice also. So these are the 6 constitutional guarantees which are there, and which also ensures the human right jurisprudence so far as the administration of criminal justice is concerned. So in the nutshell, we have talked about the Article 14. Article 20 involves the principle of ex post facto law. It means nullum crimen sine lege and nulla poena sine lege. There can be no crime without a law and no punishment without a law. So if a person is to be made punishable, or whether his act or omission comes within the definition of law or not, for that purpose it is very much required that a person can be accused and convicted only for an offense, for an act which has been defined as an offense under the law, and that law should be in force on the date when it is committed. It means if a particular act is not a crime on a particular date, then we cannot punish a person for that particular act, because we cannot give the retrospective effect to the law, neither to the criminal law, neither to the punishment. We cannot enhance the punishment for a particular crime from a back date. So this there is prevention of ex post facto operation of criminal law under Article 20 of the Constitution, and this principle is also enshrined in Article 11, Clause 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We all know that how the principles of human rights jurisprudence which are there in the UDHR, that is Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they have also been incorporated in the Indian Constitution. Then second one is protection of double jeopardy, autrefois acquit and autrefois convict, and these are the French terms. Autrefois means once or formerly. So accordingly, autrefois convict and autrefois acquit means that not formally, means formally or once acquitted or convicted. It means if a person has already been convicted for an offense, then he cannot be convicted for the same offense again. So both these terms relate to the concept of double jeopardy, and it is a remedy against the conviction of a person twice for the same offense. So, and this principle of double jeopardy ensures the human rights, and it is also incorporated in the criminal procedure code also. In certain provisions are there in the criminal procedure code which also protect the person from being doubly punished. Then we have already explained, I have already explained this due concept of law that is very much there within Article 21 of the Constitution. And then we have discussed so many procedures, safeguards are there under Article 22. of the Constitution, number 1, clause 22, Article 22, clause 1 says that grounds of arrest has to be informed. It says that what is the reason of the arrest must be told to the person who is being arrested for that offense. This is for the purpose of enabling the arrested person to seek the judicial redress. And the Supreme Court has also held that Article 22, clause 1 embodies a rule which has always been regarded as a vital and fundamental for safeguarding personal liberty in all legal systems where the rule of law prevails. The two requirements of clause 1 of Article 22 were meant to afford the earliest opportunity to the arrested person to remove any mistake, misapprehension, or misunderstanding in the minds of the arresting authority, and also to know exactly what the accusation against him is so that he can exercise the second right. That is the right of consulting a legal practitioner of his choice, and so that he may be defended accordingly. So this Criminal Procedure Code also provides the right to be brought before a judicial magistrate. So when a person has been arrested, clause 2 of Article 22 provides that he must be produced before the magistrate within 24 hours. And this also contains, the Criminal Procedure Code also contains the similar provisions and forbids the detection of the person anywhere else other than a police station. And this also involves the right of bail. The aim of the provision of bail is to restore the individual his liberty pending the adjudication of his guilt by the court. It protects unconvicted persons from hazards of incarceration by granting them the presumption of innocence. And the courts have held that bail is a right, and which should be, and of which the criminal should be informed when he is being arrested, and the same should be granted without imposing any kind of unreasonable conditions. And then there are various rights for the reasonable investigation, interrogation, search, and seizure also. And then very, very important right which is there in clause 3 of the Article 20 is that of right to silence, that is rule against self-incrimination. So Indian Constitution says that no person accused of any offense shall be compelled to be a witness against himself. And this principle is also contained in Article 14, Clause G of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. And CRPC also enjoins a person to answer truthfully the questions put to him by an investigation officer. And so this constitutional provision gives the protection against the self-incrimination. And that's why you all know that under Section 25 of the Evidence Act, the whatever statements are given before the police are not admissible as a piece of evidence before a court of law, because it is presumed that police take out or elicit the statements from the criminal by torturing the criminals. So that's why this kind of safeguard has been provided under the Constitution. And unless and until the statements are given before the magistrate, you all know the confessions made before the police are of does not carry any kind of evidentiary value. Then various protections are there from the unlawful search and seizure. Since the time is, how much time is left?
Ma'am, you can continue, no issues.
Okay. So there is a right to, another right that is there involving the human rights jurisprudence is right to fair pre-trial detention. When accused person is in custody pending trial for any reason, then human dignity should be accorded to him. The Supreme Court has in various cases laid down dicta that accused in pre-trial detention are entitled to fair and decent treatment by way of comfort, medical attention, etc., so that their humanity is not degraded and dignity is offended. And the Supreme Court has also criticized the violation of the human rights during the pre-trial detention and has ordered compensation for the unlawful detention. Courts have recognized the right to compensation in respect of unlawful detention through legislation though though earlier the legislation was not there, but now the provision is there in the CRPC itself for the providing of the compensation. So these kinds of human rights things are involved in the so far as the procedural law is concerned. Then another aspect of human right in criminal justice administration is right to a speedy trial. So the principle of openness of judicial proceedings act as a check against the caprice or the vagaries that build up that hinder in building up the confidence of the people in judicial administration. That's why the right to public and the speedy trial is one of the basic foundations of human rights jurisprudence in criminal law. That whatever trial is being done, it should be done in the open court. And the right to public trial is also implicit in Article 14 and under Article 21 of the Constitution, as well as certain safeguards are also there for this purpose in the Criminal Procedure Code. So it is said that justice delayed is justice denied. Though there are no specific provisions for a speedy trial in the Indian Constitution, but by judicial interpretation, the Supreme Court has held that Article 21 of the Constitution confers this right of speedy trial on the accused. And the human rights of the accused as well as of the victim find mention in the Constitution and various enactments also. So if we look at the procedural law, we find that how this philosophy of constitutionalism has been involved. So our CRPC, though the 1950s and in 1960s period, the Criminal Procedure Code was on the lines of the 1898 code. But right from the early 70s, that coincided with the first phase of criminal justice reforms, and the Law Commission gave its report, 41st report on the criminal procedure reforms, and said that a new form of CRPC should be there. So in 1973, a new CRPC came. And this new CRPC of 1973 involves various principles of human rights. And by having the provisions regarding the speedy disposal of the cases, due process considerations, and fair deal should be given to the poor sections of the society, that the legal aid provisions are also there in the CRPC. So human rights jurisprudence is also involved so far as the procedure of administration of criminal justice is concerned. And for this purpose, there are 6 significant features in the CRPC which ensures that these constitutional principles are involved in the administration of criminal justice. So there is a clear demarcation of the stages and the functional functions allocated to the different agencies for the purpose of taking up the procedures. And different authorities are there, and they have got a different kinds of procedure which is to be resorted to. Then ensuring the speedy criminal proceedings. Safeguard is there for the pre-trial stage rights. And the very, very important thing is pre-sentence hearing and focus on the reformative sentencing. And then special measures are there for the indigent persons who cannot afford the legal aid or who cannot afford the services of the advocates. For them also, such kinds of indigent and poor person also, special measures are there. Then the victim justice has also been recognized under the Criminal Procedure Code. So there are different sections and are there. And so if we look upon the demarcation of the authorities, recently this Directorate of Prosecution post have been incorporated under the CRPC. And this separation has led to the allocation of different functions to the different functionaries. And because there has been a demand that the investigation should be separated from the other functions of the police. But that demand has only been met in 2005 when the Directorate of Prosecution post was created, and different hierarchies of prosecution functionaries were given in the CRPC. And if we look at the speedy criminal proceedings under the Criminal Procedure Code, we find that Section 57 prohibits police custody beyond 24 hours without the authorization of the magistrate. So this is nothing but the involvement of constitutional principle here, which was there in Article 22. And if more than 24 hours custody requires remand, then application is to be given under the 167A of the code. And under section 167 clause 2, the magistrate can grant two kind of remands: judicial remand or the police remand. So police remand can be given only in initial stage to a maximum period of 15 days. But judicial remand may be for a longer period, though for 15 days at a time. The remandee may remain under trial up to 90 days in cases of offences which are punishable with more than 10 years. And in all other cases, the maximum period of remand shall be for 60 days. So depending upon the nature and the gravity of the offences, remand can be of different. But if the remand is to increase beyond 90 days, then it can only be a judicial remand and there cannot be the police remand. And then there are certain pre-trial stage rights of the accused. So power to arrest, search and seizure and interrogate person are the means by which the executive operates in the pre-trial stages. And since most significant encroachment on the freedom of the accused is effected by the exercise of the powers of the arrest, section 49 to 60 of the CRPC enumerates different rights of accused, and these rights are placed immediately before the general power of the arrest. And these pre-rights of the accused are right to be informed of the ground of arrest, section 50. Then arrestee's obligation, and the person who is arresting, he has obligation to inform the person concerned or to his nominated person about the fact and about the fact of arrest, and also the place where the arrestee is to be kept, and that is under section 50 capital A of CRPC. Then there should be medical examination by the medical practitioner after the arrest under section 53, and then arrest should be rationalized by providing distinct procedure for arrest in respect to offences which are punishable with less than 7 years of imprisonment, and this comes under section 41 capital A. And then there are certain formalities which are required before the arrest, which are provided under section 41 clause B of the CRPC. And then there is a duty to set up district level control room and also to display the details of the arrested person under section 41 clause C of the CRPC. And then under section 41 clause D, the right of arrestee to meet an advocate during interrogation is also secured, and arrestee is not to be released without the legal proceedings. It is provided by section 59 of the CRPC. So all these important provisions of the Criminal Procedure Code are based upon the reformative philosophy, and also for the purpose of ensuring the human rights of the persons who are under trial and whose guilt has not yet been determined. And then if we look at the sentencing, after recording of the conviction, the accused is given a right to give a pre-sentence hearing under section 235 clause 2 and under section 248 clause 2. That pre-sentence hearing provision is there, that after the determination of the guilt, it is asked from the criminal that whether such kind of sentence should be, why this kind of sentence should not be given to you. So he is informed about the sentence which is going to be imposed upon him. So if you want to raise an objection, he can do so. So this right to pre-sentence hearing and obligation to award reformative sentencing has been imposed upon the judiciary. So before passing the order on the sentence, the court is obliged to consider imposition of reformative sentences, because if the person who has committed the crime is a juvenile, Then under the Probation of Offenders Act, certain provisions are there which need to be followed. And then you all know that there is a different juvenile justice jurisprudence, and we have different law for them. And whatever provisions are there for the protection of the interest of the juveniles, they all must be respected too. So under Section 360 and Section 361 of the CRPC, the things have been mandated that the sentencing has to be reformative first. So purpose of the penology or the criminology in present times is not a retribution of the deterrence, but it is a reformative approach, whether it is a determination of the guilt or whether it is a sentencing policy. Both the things should involve the human rights jurisprudence. So now we have talked about the rights of the criminal, the rights of the accused, and what are the safeguards are there. But like criminals, the victims are also very, very integral part of the criminal justice system in India. And though it is said that victimology is a growing branch of criminology, but now it is very, very separate and independent branch. A lot of studies are being done so far as the victimology is concerned. So victim is very, very important, because victim of crime is one who triggers the whole of the criminal process. But there has not been any systematic or uniform body of legal provisions entailing the status and rights of the victim in the legal system, and not there had been any clear-cut guidelines or the legal provisions guiding the police, prosecution, judicial officers, and health officials to deal and address the grievances of the victims in keeping with the developments of human rights jurisprudence, and so far as the administration of criminal justice is concerned. So General Assembly of United Nations in November 29, 1985 adopted a declaration. It was a declaration of basic principles of justice for victims of crime and abuse of power. And this declaration is very, very important recognition of the need to set norms and minimum standards in international and national legal framework for the rights of victims. And this United Nations declaration recognizes 4 major components of the rights of the victims of crime. Number 1, access to justice and fair treatment. Number 2, restitution. Number 3, compensation. And lastly, rehabilitation. So the objective of the victimology is not only to provide justice and fair treatment to the victim, but also to restitute him and to provide him with compensation and the restitution also. So if we look in the Indian context, though, if we look at in historical perspective, we find that even in Manusmriti, we find that some kind of compensation was being paid to the victim whenever the crime was committed. And even in Anglo-Saxon system of criminal justice in India, means when the India was under the colonial rule, the victim was not completely neglected. And these kinds of compensation were also found in the Code of Hammurabi. And it has been quite common in the early civilization to pay compensation to victims from whatever penalty was imposed upon the offender, which is now known as restitution. But the picture began to change with the modern criminal justice system, and where the government itself assumed the responsibility for dispensing justice by not only bringing the offender to the book, but also with the appropriation of the fines to the state coffers, and the victim was left with ineffective remedies. It means whenever the penalty was imposed upon the criminal for committing the crime, the fine was collected in the state exchequer and nothing was paid to the victim. A very meager amount was paid. So the criminal justice system in India basically has basically been concerned with the criminals, whether it is a conviction, whether it is a treatment or reformation or rehabilitation, or the simple object of ascertaining the guilt or innocence of the accused. The whole of the criminal justice jurisprudence used to evolve around the accused only. So, but now the emphasis is upon the victimology also, that what should be the rights of the victim and how his or her grievances should be redressed. So this all came with the became much more common with the post-Malimat Committee. You all know that in 2003, various amendments were proposed for the overhauling of the criminal justice jurisprudence. So Malimat Committee report is very, very important in this context of 2003, and because of which only the amendments were made in CRPC in 2005 and 2009. And through the amendments of CRPC in 2005 and 2009, various provisions have been added so far as victim justice is concerned. So far as the recognition of victim justice is concerned, very first time the term victim was defined, because before 2000, between 2005 and 2009, whatever amendments have taken place in CRPC, it is very, very landmark so far as the victimology is concerned, because before that there was no definition of victim even. So now section 2WA of the CRPC defines the victim, and the victim have also got the right, have also got the right to appeal under section 372, and victim inclusion is also been done in the plea bargaining. So far as if you look at the definition of the victim, how the CRPC defines it, so for the first time in 2009 by the amendment, this definition was incorporated, and now the victim means a person who has suffered any loss or injury caused by reason of the act or omission for which the accused person has been charged, and the expression victim includes his or her guardian or legal heir also, because sometimes what happens when the crime is committed, the victim dies. So in that case, the compensation is to be given to the guardian or to the legal heirs. So in the definition of victim, the legal guardian and the legal heir has also been included. Then there are certain compensatory clauses in the special laws also under the Probation of Offenders Act 1958 and Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribe Act 1989, and even in Domestic Violence Act 2005, specific provisions are made regarding the compensation of victim is concerned. Then there are various administrative measures also taken by the government from time to time for redressing the grievances of the victim and providing with them the compensation. So during the last decade, the government of India has also framed various schemes to strengthen the victim justice, and it has introduced the scheme for the relief and rehabilitation of the victims of rape, and a scheme for the compensation of the victim of violation by the left-wing extremist. Then there has been central scheme for assistance to the victims of terrorist and communal violence. Rehabilitation packages have also been given who were the victims of the 1984 riots. And so these kinds of various schemes have floated at different times by the government to provide compensation to the victim or to give restitute them. So now we have talked about criminology, we have talked about victimology. Now there are important authorities which are there for providing justice to the victims of crime, and here an act is very, very important, that is the Protection of Human Rights Act 1993. Under this act, not only the National Human Rights Commission has been established, but State Human Rights Commission are also there. Then Section 30 of this Protection of Human Rights Act 1993 also says that the state government may, with the concurrence of the Chief Justice of the concerned High Court, they may notify in each district a human rights court to try the offences arising out of the violation of human rights. So we see that lots of statutory arrangements have been made for the amelioration of the conditions of the victims of crime and to ensure the human rights. Now we will come to the cases, important cases on the judicial measures which have been taken, because we all know that it is the judiciary which has played a very, very laudable role so far as the administration of criminal justice is concerned, or the securing of human rights is concerned. So the higher judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court. It has contributed very significantly in the interpretation and implementation of the constitutional guarantees in criminal justice administration, and both through the final appeals as well as through the writ intervention under Article 32, if the Supreme Court, and by under Article 2 to 6 if the High Court has been there. So this role is very, very significantly reflected, that of the judiciary, not only in substantive law but also in procedural law. So if we look upon the role of judiciary, mainly in the cases of death penalty, in the cases of attempted suicide, in the cases of euthanasia, adult homosexuality, fair trial requirements, or the law of arrest is concerned, or so far as the violation of human rights under the custody are concerned. So in these quarters, the judiciary have played a very, very remarkable role. And if we look at the whole scenario, we find that post-Maneka period has been very, very important, where judiciary has really played a pivotal role in the protection of the human right. Because Supreme Court said in the Maneka's case that the basic foundation of criminal justice jurisprudence should be based upon the human right. And it says that Article 21 does not mean any procedure laid down in the statute, but just, fair and reasonable procedure. And that is the term law in Article 21 envisages not any law, but a law which is right, just, fair, and not arbitrary, fanciful, or oppressive. And accordingly, the Supreme Court, after the case of Maneka Gandhi, in different cases also, Supreme Court has been a watchdog of the human rights in different cases. So if we look upon the case, which is very, very important, is that of Francis Corelli versus Administrator, Union Territory of Delhi, as well as Nilbati Behera versus State of Orissa. In these cases, the court held that the constitutional and juristic foundations of the liability of the states have been formally and finally laid down in these two cases. So even the claim of the sovereign immunity, which arises out of the state discharging the sovereign function, is held to be no defense at all against the act of violation of the constitutionally guaranteed foundation human rights. It means even the sovereign authority, even though they are having the powers to take away the life or the liberty of any person, but they cannot do so if it is devoid of the human right principles. It means whenever any procedure is to be taken for the purpose of depriving a person of his life or personal liberty, or where the guilt is to be proved of a person, the human right principles must be looked into. So some of the very, very important cases are the certain guidelines were laid down for the lie detector test of an accused in the case of Srimati Selvi versus State of Karnataka, where the question was whether the involuntary administration of scientific techniques, namely narco analysis or polygraph test and brain electrical activation profile, that is BEAP, test violates the right against self-incrimination, which is incorporated in Article 20, Clause 3 of the Constitution. In answer, the court said that it is a reasonable restriction on the personal liberty as understood in the context of Article 21 of the Constitution. And so Supreme Court laid down a number of guidelines so far as how the lie detector test is to be done. So various guidelines have been given, but I am not discussing due to that of time. So this case is very, very landmark, which says that there's a right of rule against self-incrimination cannot be violated, even if a person is charged with the crime. And then there are the cases of delay in the execution of death sentences. And in various cases, Supreme Court has laid down that whenever there is a delay in the sentencing of the capital punishment, it can be converted into life imprisonment. So on the ground of delay, the life imprisonment can be condoned into life imprisonment. And the important case has been that of Shatrughan Chauhan, though there are earlier cases also, but I am not discussing here. So in the case of Shatrughan Chauhan, case of 2014, it was a five-judge bench court, five-judge bench court, where the Supreme Court commuted the death sentence of 15 petitioners whose mercy petition had been pending in the President's office for considering a long period, mainly on the ground of delay in deciding about the mercy petitions. So we all know that justice delayed is justice denied. So when a lot of delay is taking place in executing the sentence, it is better to commute it into life imprisonment, because during the sentencing period, criminal undergoes a lots of mental agony, and sometimes it distorts his personality also. So it is not in favor of his human rights. And then in Muhammad Arif and others of 2014 case again, where the order of the Supreme Court rules that a procedure will be there and no oral hearing of review petition will be done in death sentence cases. But it was challenged, and in this case also, Muhammad Arif cases also, the Supreme Court held that because of the special nature of the death sentence, oral hearing can even be allowed even at the review stage, because it is part of the Article 21 of the Constitution. And then another important case is that of Santosh Kumar Bariyar versus State of Maharashtra of 2009. And it is a very, very landmark case on the death penalty in India. And this case deals with two important legal principles. Number one, power of the session court to grant pardon under the provision of section 306 of the CRPC, and interpretation of the rarest of rare doctrine in awarding the death sentence. In this case, the Supreme Court, among other things, examined the timing and the degree of discretion available to a session judge to grant pardon under section 307 of the CRPC. The court concluded that if it is to be held that in each and every case pardon can only be granted at the initial stage, the power conferred on the session judge under section 307 of the CRPC will become useless. So the court affirmed the wide discretion of the session judge to grant pardon under section 307 of the CRPC. And while upholding the law which was decided in the Bachan Singh case, Justice S.B. Sinha in Santosh Bariyar case said that he commented on the rarest of rare theory of death penalty, which explicitly proposes that life imprisonment is the rule and death penalty is the exception. So the rarest of rare doctrine places an extraordinary burden on the court to carry out an objective assessment of facts to justify the use of capital punishment in a given case. And so the court is duty bound to equally consider aggravating and mitigating circumstances before arriving at a decision. So whenever the death penalty is to be given, both the factors and both the circumstances have to be assessed, whether there are mitigating factors or there are aggravating factors. And only then the court should take a decision. So it means that for awarding the death penalty, the court will have to provide a very clear evidence as to why the convict is not fit for any kind of reformatory and rehabilitation scheme. And the evidence must not only relate to the crime, but also to the criminal, including his or her socioeconomic background. So all these factors are to be taken into account if the death penalty is to be given. And then there have been landmark cases on the questioning of the criminalization of attempted suicide in the 1980s and 90s. There were several high courts and Supreme Court ruling questioning the continuous criminalization of attempted suicide as an offense under section 309 of the IPC on constitutional grounds. In P. Rathiram versus Union of India, 1994, leading Supreme Court case it is, where it was held that section 309 is unconstitutional. But in 1996, in the case of Gyankur versus State, the Supreme Court restored the conservative proof Section 309 position. So in P. Rathinam, it was held the right to life also includes the right to die. But in Gyan Kaur, it was made clear that no, the right to life does not include right to die. So this Article 309 is not unconstitutional in nature. So and that way we can say that time and again the Supreme Court has taken a lot of measures in ensuring the human rights of the not only of the criminals but also that of the victims. And very, very important case, as you all must also be aware of, is that of D.K. Basu versus State of West Bengal, where Supreme Court has laid down a very, very exhaustive guidelines so far as how the arrest is to be made. I am not going into detail because a lot many more than 10 guidelines are there. You can read this case. It is very, very important one. And another aspect which involves the human rights principles is that of legal aid jurisprudence. And this legal aid jurisprudence is very, very facet of the fair trial, because a person who is indigent, who is poor, he should be provided with the legal aid. So Article 39A of the Constitution provides that the state shall secure the operation of the legal system which promotes justice on the basis of equal opportunity, and to provide free legal aid by suitable legislation. Law was also enacted in 1987, that is the Legal Services Authorities Act 1987, to provide the legal aid. So Section 12 of this particular act provides the list of persons who are eligible for having the legal aid. Otherwise, this Article 39A of the Constitution was incorporated by an amendment in 1976 by the 42nd Amendment, and this particular amendment is also very, very important, because not only it incorporated the provision relating to the legal aid, but it also removed the entry 3, that is administration of justice, from the state list and added it under the concurrent list as entry 11 capital A. So the object behind such change was to enable both the union and the state to make the laws for legal aid and promotion of the equal justice for all. And besides Article 39A, Article 41 of the Constitution also requires the state to provide for the public assistance in cases of undeserved want within the limits of its economic capacity and the development. So a state is under an obligation subject to its economic policy to provide free legal aid to poor, illiterate or ignorant person. And there are various important cases also regarding this legal aid. One of the important cases that of state of Maharashtra versus Manubhai of 1995. And it has been said that it is not only the responsibility of the government to give the legal aid, but the law colleges which are very much there, they should also produce such kinds of students who can come forward and provide the legal aid to the poor and indigent persons. And then there is case of a state of MP versus Shobharam of 1966, and there it was said that the right to consult and be defended by a legal practitioner of his choice is guaranteed in order to enable the criminal to prepare for his case. So this right not only belongs to the arrested person, but and not only at the pre-trial stage, but also at the trial before a criminal court or before a special tribunal, and whether the arrest is made under the general law or under a special statute. So this right guaranteed is very, very wide. It does not matter that at what stage of the trial the case is, or under which law a person has been apprehended with. So in whatever law he has been arrested, he will have the right to legal aid. So even in cases of terrorism, the terrorists have also been provided with the legal aid. We all know that how much criticism was there when a lawyer agreed for fighting the case of the Ajmal Kasab. But Supreme Court said that no, he has got the, it is a legal right that he is to be defended, and for that purpose, he can have the legal aid. So in that case also the legal aid was provided even to a terrorist. So it does not matter that what is the nature of the crime, who has committed it, and at what stage the trial is, the legal aid will be available to all. And we all know that there are various cases in olden times also, like if we see the case of, even before, the M.H. Hoscott case is very, very landmark for the purpose of legal aid is concerned, of 1978. And the Supreme Court here had taken a very innovative step for the first time for the purpose of humanizing the administration of criminal justice and suggesting the free legal aid to be provided by the state to the poor prisoners who were facing a prison sentence. So provision for the free legal aid is also the very part of the fair trial procedure, which is ensured by the Article 21 of the Constitution. Then another case that I would like to mention is that of Sukhdas versus Union Territory of Arunachal Pradesh of 1986. Here the court said that the right to free legal aid services is a fundamental right, and it is not conditional upon the accused applying for free legal assistance. It means person need not, it is not necessary for the accused to apply for the legal aid. It is the right, it must be given to him. And Supreme Court said that the state cannot seek to avoid this constitutional obligation by pleading the financial or the administrative inability. So state is bound to provide legal aid to the person if one is not capable of fighting the case on his own. And then Supreme Court reaffirmed that the right to free legal aid attaches itself at the first appearance in front of a judicial magistrate and not just at the trial. So when the criminal is making first appearance before the magistrate, there only. And that's why it is said that when the arrest is being made, the arrestee should be informed of his right to free legal aid. It means when for the very first time he is produced before the magistrate, he will be provided with the legal aid. Then further, he will, at any stage of trial, he will have the facility of this legal aid. So this is one of the very, very important rights involving the human right jurisprudence for the purpose of securing the human right of the arrestee. And this section 304 of the CRPC also talks about the free legal aid. It states that if an accused is unrepresented at trial before the court of session, the court should assign a lawyer to the accused, and the legal advice provided should be independent and competent, and not from lawyers who are attached to a police station or a raw recruit. It means in the name of legal aid, you cannot give any kind of lawyer to the person for defending in case. The person who is there on the panel of lawyers for the legal aid must be a competent person. And so judges also have an obligation to explain to an unrepresented accused person the rules relating to the provision of free legal aid as soon as the accused is produced before the court for the very first time. So it is not only the duty of the state, it is also the duty of the judiciary to apprise the arrested person or the convicted person of his legal right. And then a very, very important article you all know is Article 142 of the Constitution, where in the name of doing complete justice, the Supreme Court can pass any order in a matter pending before it. So a kind of residual power has been given to the Supreme Court under Article 142 for promoting justice or for giving justice to the person so far as the administration of criminal justice is concerned. So this Article 142 has helped the court in providing equal justice, and until there was no separate enactment for free legal service by interpreting the provisions of preamble, fundamental rights and directive principles in such a way as to bring free legal aid within the scope of the fundamental right. So when the provision of legal aid, free legal aid was not incorporated under Article 39 or Article 39A of the Constitution, or till this Legal Services Authority Act was not enacted, the Supreme Court was taking advantage of the Article 142 of the Constitution to help the person to have the legal aid. So lastly, by concluding, I can say that after the case of Maneka Gandhi of 1978 has proved to be a multidimensional in introducing the human rights jurisprudence in criminal justice administration. And from the perusal of these different cases of the Supreme Court and the High Court, we see that through the judicial contribution, it is very, very evident that Indian judiciary has been very sensitive and very alive to the human rights so far as the administration of criminal justice is concerned. So, through the judicial activism has been given the new tool, and it has devised new mechanisms and methods for the purpose of indicating the most precious and most precious of the right, that is right to life and personal security. Because whenever a person is committing a crime, his life and his personal liberty become at stake. And so how far it can be taken away has been, the limits has been set by our Indian judiciary. So if we can conclude, we can say that so far as the protection of human rights is concerned in the administration of criminal justice, the role of judiciary has been very, very unparalleled. And the contribution of Supreme Court in not only in projecting and proliferating, but also in popularizing the criminal justice jurisprudence with human right approach is very, very outstanding. So I think this much is enough for today's lecture, where we have discussed that what is the objective of administration of criminal justice, what are the different functionaries involved, what has been the criminology and chronological aspect of the criminal administration of justice, and how the judiciary has played a very, very positive and laudable role in protecting the human rights of the criminal in the administration of criminal justice. And not only it has ensured the rights of the criminals, but victims' rights have also been ensured. So not only it provides justice to the accused, to the criminals, but also to the victims concerned. So with this, I thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this wonderful session. Really, it was very insightful and thought-provoking. Ma'am, you explained us the objective of criminal justice system in India. You also explained us the functionaries who look after the criminal justice system. You also explained us the different safeguards regarding criminal justice system. Ma'am, you explained us the importance of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and you also explained us about the criminal justice jurisprudence, and also explained us regarding the landmark decisions related to it. So once again, thank you so much, ma'am. Now I would like to invite our director, Professor Dr. Moin Athar, sir, to give the vote of thanks. Sir, please, if you could.
Thank you so much, Preeti ma'am.
नमस्कार सर, नमस्कार. आप तो चले ही
नमस्कार. Thank you so much.
हम बोलने में इतना बिजी थे कि आपको हम देख ही नहीं पाए.
आपका ये मैराथन प्रेजेंटेशन बच्चों के लिए बहुत यूजफुल रहा होगा, क्योंकि क्रिमिनल जस्टिस एंड ह्यूमन राइट्स पे जो आपका ये प्रेजेंटेशन था, इट वाज अल्टीमेट. Definitely the students must have been benefited through your presentation, your lecture, because your lecture covers each and every dimensions of the topic.
I tried to make it exhaustive, sir.
Really, it was a marathon presentation. I'm highly thankful to you that you have spared your precious time for the SRMU to present your presentation in this Institute of Legal Studies, and I hope that the students must have been benefited through your exhaustive lecture. But in this chilling cold, you have spared your time for all of us, your precious time for all of us. I'm really thankful to you, और I hope कि जैसा कि वैक्सीनेशन शुरू होना है आज से कोविड का, तो मुझे लगता है कि आने वाले दिनों में हम ऑफलाइन मोड पर भी एक 1-to-1 इंटरेक्शन कर पाने की कैपेसिटी में होंगे. थैंक यू सो मच मैम.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So nice of you. So nice of you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. See you again.
May God keep you healthy.
Thank you. आपकी तबीयत ठीक है अभी?
हाँ मैं ठीक हूँ
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Namaskar.
Once again, thanks a lot, Preeti ma'am,
Thank
for
you,
this wonderful
Nishant.
session.
Thank you, Nishant.
And ma'am, by your permission, shall we close this session?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, thanks a lot, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.